Life and Works of Niccolo Machiavelli, Humanities 1301. In his early life, he was born to a rich family. They did have a decent amount of power, but he was born to the poorest of the family, a doctor of law who could barely afford to make ends meet. I think his name was Bernardo. On May 3rd, 1469. He likely spent a good amount of his childhood in his father's study. We know he read the translated works of many Greek authors as well as studying Latin and many Latin authors, all at the early age of 7. He was very young when he started, and at the age of 12, he studied under, I will butcher this, Paolo de Ronciglione, a well-known teacher to humanists, and later in life attended lectures by Marcello di Virgilio Aggiani, a professor from the University of Florence, where he would attend a couple of his lectures, as he wrote in, I think, another journal of his. Revealed in letters to a friend, he listened to many sermons by Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who rose to power in Florence from 1494 to 1498, when he was hanged for treason, if I remember. And he was later referenced in The Prince as the unarmed prophet, somebody who must not win. In the coming days after the execution of Savonarola, Machiavelli was named the head of the Second Chancery, starting his political career. He had very little to no experience and was not very well known at the time. A month after that, he was also appointed as the secretary to the Committee of War, the 10, and his first major mission was to the French court, which lasted 6 months from July 1500 to January 1501, so about 6 months, and he was just going back and forth to the French court from Florence. He went on a lot of similar diplomatic missions in France, meeting people like Cesare Borgia, the son of the Pope Alexander VI, and Pope Julius II, who later he had some issues with. He convinced the Gonfaloniere, which is just a high-ranking official in Florence, Soderini, to let him create a militia force to limit reliance on mercenary groups. And if I remember, the Soderini had been able to instate himself as the Gonfaloniere for life, at least until he was later killed. During 1502 to 1507, he worked together with Leonardo da Vinci on multiple projects, with the most well-known being artificial river that connected an irrigation system that connected the Arno River to the sea, and this had the dual purpose of irrigating the Arno Valley while also cutting off the water supply to Pisa. And it was probably both military and just useful for Arno Valley. In 1512, this was basically the end of his political career, as his militia was defeated by a Spanish army Julius II had enlisted, and then soon after, the Medici family returned to rule over Florence, and he was sent into exile under suspicion of conspiracy. At the same time, this is when Savonarola was sentenced to death, if I recall correctly. The most famous of Machiavelli's works, The Prince, published in 1532, I think about 5 years after his death. With the so The Prince it posed itself as a guide to rulers, with the main takeaway of it being the ends justify the means. One of the most remembered quotes other than this is also, what was it? If you cannot be loved and feared, then it's better to be feared than loved. And in this book, he basically teaches how to cruelly rule over people. But when you compare this to the actions that he takes in real life and his other works, you realize that he's not stating on this is how a person should be who rules, but he is giving a straightforward description of what happens or what people in power do in order to keep their power cruelly. Almost describe it basically because he's been in the politics for a decent amount of time, and he had served before that, not in politics, but seeing everything happen. And he kind of described all the tricks and tips that these people who are corrupt, at least in his eyes, use to keep their power and silence people. Florentine Histories, published 1532, or at least that's the closest we can get to it. The Florentine Histories had previously been taken at face value, a lot like the Prince, but recently we have re-examined and reinterpreted it, at least relatively recently. I think in about like the last 50 years, which is a lot when we're talking about all of history. The Florentine Histories are another recording of the corruptions and issues he sees within his home, which he described in this text as great and wretched. A city that is great and wretched. But we know how much he loves from his own notes and letters and just how he has acted throughout all his life. He never left Florence. He loved Florence. And to call it a great and wretched city, he shows that he both thinks it's wretched, but can see the greatness that he once saw before. And he kind of describes how it became divided since its founding, the class conflicts among other things, and then of course the rise of the Medici, who he did not enjoy. And if you read at face value, it again is a negative, pessimistic. It kind of shows him how much he's hated what the city has become. But he's kind of just again stating what's happening to almost like a wake-up call to the people of Florence. In The Art of War, this is the only book that was published in 1521, and it was published, it's the only one that was published while he was still alive. And it goes into details on his beliefs on the military and its place within life. This is one of the least looked at and researched of his works because this is the one that is the most straightforward. He kind of shows he describes a military as the roof of a palace which protects the contents within, something necessary to a society if it wants to kind of thrive. And he just goes about covering everything he believes, from how troops should be treated to the tactics and formations you should be using, to how to organize camps, specifically going in on about how the Romans would organize their camps, to artillery, fortifications, logistics, and as mentioned before, he wanted to work towards a Florentine militia. He did work and get this developed with Soderini, and this is something he really believed that the town of Florence needed. And this is another reason why it was not very well researched, or at least not as much as his other works, because this one is honestly written at face value, or at least for now we've interpreted it as being written at face value. This is just how he believes the military should be and how he believes a military belongs to a society. Discourse on Livy, published in 1531. The discourses on Livy was for once dedicated not to a patron or somebody who, like the Medici family, or I think Julius II was another who was a possible patron to the last three writings. This one was dedicated to his friends Zanobi, Buondelmonte, and Cosimo Rucellai. And they were dedicated specifically as people who deserve to be princes, or should be princes. And the things that he discussed in this work kind of contrasted everything else what he had. And it could either be interpreted, or it is being interpreted, either as him growing and kind of having a deeper understanding of what it means to rule, or maybe this is just where he finally wrote how he truly felt about the ideas of ruling and how the politics, or ideas of ruling, and his real views on politics. It is another ones where we can take it mainly at face value, but not the same as The Art of War. But with that dedication and the rest of the different writings and details he goes through these books in the discourses of Livy, you kind of get to understand how he feels about a lot of the politics. This goes mainly on I think it's two books, mainly going through the internal problems and then the external problems of ruling, and of course going in on the work of, so I think the first few years of Livy. And the conclusion for this is just Machiavelli was most known for The Prince, and if you've ever heard of Machiavelli, you know it's Machiavellian thinking. A lot of things I think people roll them up together with communism, but in reality, if you look and interpret his works, at least what seems to be properly, since interpretation is always up to subjective thoughts and ideas, since we can't exactly ask the man ourselves, you kind of see that he did believe in power, but he didn't believe in this cruelty. And he hated the corruption that poisoned his city of Florence, which he had lived in and loved and spent all of his life. And if he saw how it was interpreted, or maybe if he knew how The Prince had been interpreted as it was taken at face value as his true beliefs, he'd probably have written a lot more or been disgusted with how it ended up. Maybe he'd laugh about it, but we can kind of see exactly what he really believes in by just reinterpreting or interpreting all of his works properly, or at least under a bit of scrutiny, and not taking it directly as face value as him training up rulers and politicians to be cruel and make choices only at the expense of all the people for the best possible outcomes. And these are the citations that I used.